few months ago, China rolled out an updated map of its territories just in time for the new school year. Normally, this is nothing strange. After all, every country in the world does this every so often. It's a good way to keep their citizens updated about how borders might have changed, providing better outlines, and to make the details available for every child's geography lessons in the country of their birth. But China peeved off just about every neighbor it has by claiming land that they simply have no legal right to claim. And this tragedy is nothing new. For centuries, China's had an uncompromising view of sovereignty. If their ancestors ruled over even one single square foot of land, it would forever belong to them. It doesn't matter how long ago it was, how short their rule there lasted, or even if it was accepted by the world. If at any point in time China had power over a place, it will forever be theirs. Their claim is final, to hell with what the people in those countries think or what the world has to say about it. Before, the world mostly ignored their claims, but in the last 20 years or so, China's alarming rise as a global superpower changed the validity of their imaginary lines on a piece of paper. It's not that their position makes their decisions legit, far from it, but China now has the military, the firepower, and the numbers to make it happen. This new map made it very, very clear. It's ours. And if you don't like it, we're bringing out the guns to prove it. In more recent times, their game plan has been to throw their weight around and use their sheer size and power to steamroll their neighbors into simply giving them land to avoid a direct conflict. They are essentially the biggest bully on the playground, and the kids were just throwing their lunch money at China before China can stuff them into a locker. But now, nations are speaking up, and they're tired of China taking what they want when they want it, with no regard to the rules. The ancient nation isn't going to allow the decisions of the UN, the United States, or anyone for that matter, to decide what they can and cannot take. If it comes to open conflict, then so be it. So let's get into the many miles that China's decided that they own, and you can be sure that they're going to go in armed, ready to take what they believe belongs to them. India. Let's start with India first. The two countries have been contesting the greater Himalayan mountain ranges and the surrounding plateaus for years. It finally came to a head in 1962. Since then, India has claimed the territory, but that's being contested by Pakistan too. So while Pakistan and India were hashing things out, China went ahead and set up infrastructure full of bunkers, trenches, airfields, and lookout stations on the plateaus and in the mountains. Now, even though India technically claims this land, China openly occupies it, and they've moved down into the Kashmir district. Now, since both countries have nuclear weapons, they've agreed not to open fire on each other, but the place has been set up like a full-blown war is going to break out any second. And the soldiers have had raging fistfights, armed with handheld weapons like barbed wire clubs and metal poles. Then China ticked off Arunachal Pradesh and went ahead and called it South Tibet for good measure. The whole place is filled with Indian citizens, as it should be. It's their country after all. But those are illegal immigrants according to China's cartographers. According to the new map, China owns everything from the Himalayan plateau to Kashmir and a few other areas dotted along the mountain range. Of all the countries that China is encroaching on, India is by far the most aggressive one to keep China out of its territories. But that's only because it's the only one with a population and a defense budget big enough to put up a fight. But the rest are a different story. Nepal, Bhutan, Myanmar. Now that they've properly aggravated India, they went ahead and marked off parts of Nepal, Bhutan, and Myanmar too. China didn't waste their time with scare tactics and their powerful military presence in Bhutan. They straight up demanded that Bhutan hand over Kula Kangri and Jakalung. And to keep China off their backs, Bhutan conceded those territories over to them. But when it came to a district called Doklam, China didn't even bother to go through the formalities of asking for it. Overnight, they just started building settlements and roads there. Bhutan is powerless to stop them, and India isn't liking this at all. You see, owning Doklam gives China a strategic advantage over India in the event of an open conflict. If a war is ever going to break out, they need to have Doklam, so they didn't bother to make it official to anybody else because they knew they'd be contested from all sides. But it's too late now. They've put it on their maps, and they've got their people well set up and properly armed to keep it under their thumb if anyone tries to take it from them. Myanmar was a slightly different story. China didn't slowly increase its presence over time or in secrecy like they usually like to do. During the pandemic, while the world's attention was diverted, China went ahead and built a fence. But it is not just a barrier between agreed-upon borders. Nope, since they were there, they just went ahead and constructed 400 miles of fence line, essentially cutting off trade and communication between the people who live along the line. China didn't take any extra land, but their walls split families apart and collapsed businesses. Recently, rebel groups have tried to dismantle the fence line, only to be met with heavy military force. If the uprisings continue, it won't be long until they start chipping away at Myanmar too, under the guise of keeping their border safe from violent protests and armed rebels. This fence was put up to orchestrate hostilities, giving China every right to take over once things get violent enough. South China Seas and Islands. Now we get to even more serious disputes. The South China Seas lines were decided by China in the 1940s, without the agreement of the rest of the world or the countries that use those waters and are legally entitled to do so. According to the maps, China's lines cut into the ocean territories of Brunei, Vietnam, the Philippines, and Malaysia. For years, these imaginary lines were just something China said existed, and they never really acted upon their wishes, so everyone just ignored them. But when Dubai started constructing entire islands, it gave China an idea. They started pumping tons of sand onto coral reefs, building whole island outposts. There are dozens of them, and every single one of these outposts is armed to the teeth. For a while, the shipping vessels just took a wide berth around these hostile new islands and avoided coming into contact with Chinese forces completely without disrupting their supply chains and trade routes too much. But lately, China's started hounding fishing boats, especially the small Filipino crafts operating on the water, manned by regular civilians that have no stake in large-scale exports. These crafts are mostly owned and run by small family businesses, and the people in them aren't even armed. This water dispute also includes the Senkaku Islands, a group of islands that are rich in oil and gas reserves and are already being fought over by China, Japan, and Taiwan. But here, China is bringing out the big guns, flying heavy military aircraft in the area, and patrolling seas that they feel are rightfully theirs. It's the same line of thinking when it comes to Taiwan. China never accepted their independence, even though it's been almost 40 years since they broke off from China. The inclusion of Taiwan as a Chinese state on this map was almost expected. They've had Taiwan marked down as theirs since the 1600s after all. Right through Japanese occupation and throughout Taiwan's existence as its own country in the present day. And finally, there's the Kuril Islands that China, Russia, and Japan all want. Officially, it belongs to Russia now, but it was contested some 20 years ago between China and Russia. The two mega-nations agreed to split it in half and call it a truce. The fact that China marked off this whole island as its own is a little confusing, since China isn't exactly on bad terms with Russia. If anything, the two have set their animosities aside for the time being. You know, since the rest of the world is grinding their teeth at both of them, it makes perfect sense that they need to rely on each other in the current political climate. The only real explanation for this is China's habit of laying claim to lands based on historical reasons instead of legal ones. Russia isn't making any public comments on the rather insignificant patch, but that could be because Russia has its hands so full of other things at the moment that they aren't going to waste time squabbling over inconveniences just now. China's bold claims might seem just a little outrageous to the casual onlooker, but in reality, they couldn't have chosen a better time to make the ballsy announcement. The world is in shambles, and the governing bodies are just too busy juggling wars and boiling social unrest to apply their attention fully to events that haven't quite come to a head yet. Then, there's the recent weakening of superpower leadership to take into account, too. The current leaders of nations like Great Britain and the US just aren't equipped to deal with a threat like China, given how badly they're already handling everything else. King Charles isn't exactly the most formidable royal to sit on the throne, and on the US's front, well, Biden is a lost cause. It would be a miracle if he could even point out China on a world globe, given the obvious state that he's in. Sadly, the counties in China's sights are left to fend for themselves, with the only ones with any real voice or might being India and Japan. Every single territory China claims already has enough military presence and infrastructure in place to make a move at the drop of a hat. If they were waiting for the right time to strike, that time is now. And the release of this map makes their intentions crystal clear. China is going to take it all, whether we like it or not, and they're going to bring every ounce of their power down on the world at the slightest hint of provocation. And what about you? Where do you think China is going to claim territory next? Are they going to wait until they have these places firmly under their control before they move on? Or will they continue to steamroll over the entire planet, piece by piece, regardless of what the rulebook says? Let us know in the comments below. And like always, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and have a look at some of our other uploads. Your support is what makes it possible for our team to keep you in the loop on the current events that affect our world. See you on the next one.